Morning, everyone. I'm Professor Sarah Johnsen from the Institute for Social Policy, Housing and Equalities Research, more commonly known as I-Sphere at Heriot Watt University. I had the privilege of leading the evaluation of Turning Point Scotland's pilot project a decade ago when it supported just 22 individuals at the time. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to reflect back on that and the impact that it's had 10 years on. I'm going to begin by reassuring you that, contrary to what this presentation title implies, I'm not going to bore you with a rehearsal of what the evidence on Housing First says and why it's so compelling. I've been doing that for years, and I'm sure that many of you are quite sick to death of hearing me bang on about the subject. What I am going to do is remind everyone how that project has fed into the evidence base on Housing First here in the UK and internationally. And in so doing, I hope to highlight the influence that this evidence, along with that generated by other programmes across the UK, has had on the nature of debate about Housing First. Oh, now I seem to be having trouble moving on to the next slide. Oh, there we go, forgive me. So I, like many of you no doubt, am working from home just now. My real office on campus is a bit of a jungle. It's got lots of plants, presumably all dead now, sadly, piles of paper, as is befitting for a nerdy professor like myself, and an assortment of random knickknacks displayed on my shelves. The ornament here is something I am both rather amused by and proud of. It was presented to me for my stickability by the then CEO of Turning Point Scotland at the launch of the Legacy Project Pilots Evaluation Report in 2014. The Housing First project residents were all given one at the time in celebration of their achievements, and many of the delegates in attendance were rather tickled by the fact that I received one too, simply for surviving the evaluation. I do a lot of studies of this nature, but this particular one will stick in my memory for a number of reasons. Partly because of the extreme logistical challenges involved in trying to do longitudinal research with repeat follow-up interviews with a group of individuals who have quite frankly got lots of other things going on in their lives. I was relieved that we managed 100% success rate in following up people, and for the record, I remain really indebted to the staff at the time who supported me to do that. It was also a memorable project purely because the actual Housing First programme itself achieved the remarkable outcomes that it did, especially on housing retention, given that there were no evictions. As that proved that the outcomes reported of Housing First in the United States, where the model was developed, were replicable here. And that, of course, was really welcome news, given that there was absolutely no guarantee that Housing First was going to work in the UK, given the very different context in which it was developed. The Housing First residents were representatives of a group who have been badly let down by the system for years and years, and the fact that Housing First worked for them gave solid grounds for believing that it would for others. And of course, it has subsequently proved to do just that. I also vividly recall some very specific moments during the course of that study, some poignant, some a bit daft. I remember, for example, my surprise and delight at the physical transformation and improvements in health experienced by one particular resident, which was so extreme that I didn't actually recognise her at the point of final interview. Thankfully, she found my confusion on that rather amusing. I recall one resident's total obsession with soft furnishings, which I thought was completely brilliant, given that your typical Daily Mail reader would probably not have thought that he was even capable of giving one sod about curtains, cushions, and picture frames. But for him, the process of homemaking was pivotal in his recovery journey. And that manifests itself in the most tasteful of ways. In a similar vein, I remember the amazing artwork that another resident had created and covered his walls with. I remember being highly amused by the fact that one of the members of staff, who very kindly used to give me lifts to residents' homes, had to shove corks between her car windows and the door frame so that the windows didn't randomly sort of drop down at any moment. I still cannot help but giggle when recalling a conversation with one resident who had a long history of repeat short-term prison sentences for shoplifting. His refrain, "Oh, Sarah, it's the Valium, it makes me think I'm invisible." I could go on with anecdotes like that. Needless to say, it was an absolute privilege to share in and be witness to the journeys of these very fantastic people over the course of the 3-year study, even in the very small way that I did. The evaluation also fed into a larger European Commission-funded social experimentation project, which is an absolutely awful title for what was a really valuable project that brought together learning from 10 countries that were trialling Housing First at the time. That involved lots of trips to participating countries, accompanied by the late Ian Irvin and sometimes other members of the project team. And despite only having sort of quite recently moved to Scotland myself, I suddenly found myself translating Glaswegian into a form of English that was more recognisable to the other participants. Rather amusing, I have to say. But on a more serious note, I sincerely wish that Ian was still with us to witness the legacy, quite literally, of the bold steps that he took in setting up the pilot way back then. It's no exaggeration to say that Turning Point Scotland led from the front in assessing the effectiveness of and subsequently promoting Housing First in the UK. It was the first to develop a pilot in the UK. It invested in an independent evaluation, and that evidence has fed into a body of work that has cumulatively changed the nature of debate about the intervention in significant ways. I think it's well worth reflecting back on just how far discussions about Housing First have come over the past 10 years. I think we sometimes forget that, and perhaps some people who are newer to the subject won't be aware of the kind of distance that's been travelled. So what I plan to do now is share some of the reflections that I've published or presented publicly at various points over the past decade, as I think that gives us a window into sort of where debate was at any point in time. So I'll begin by sharing some observations from a report I wrote back in 2010, just before the pilot in Glasgow was developed. This was co-authored with Lydia Tate-Shearer, who was then research manager at Crisis, after we reviewed very early evidence about the impacts of Housing First and assessed its potential transferability to the UK. The study involved a review of published evidence, which was almost entirely US-based at the time, and a series of interviews with key stakeholders in the UK homelessness sector. And those interviews were conducted to get an indication of what people knew about it, what they thought about it, and assess whether or not there was an appetite to replicate it here. It's worth noting that not a lot was known about Housing First here at the time, and a few misconceptions about what it was and what it wasn't were already quite present. I had to diplomatically dissuade quite a few service providers from claiming that they were doing it already. Because whilst it was true that a few programs were housing rough sleepers directly from the street, they were only doing so with individuals they thought were pretty likely to succeed. The support was strictly time limited, and eligibility was very strongly contingent on users engaging proactively with support. So a far cry from the key principles of Housing First. I wouldn't normally present such a long quote, but I'm breaking with convention on this particular occasion. Please forgive me for that, simply because I think it's fascinating to look back at this in its entirety. It just shows how far we've come. So what we concluded was UK stakeholders held mixed views regarding the potential effectiveness of Housing First. A number felt that the lack of conditionality regarding consumer engagement stands in contradistinction to the increasing interventionism evident in UK homelessness policy, whereby eligibility for some programs is becoming more conditional on user compliance. And it's probably worth noting that that was probably more true in England than here north of the border. We went on to say, despite being sceptical that outcomes reported in the US would be reproduced to the same extent here, a willingness to trial Housing First clearly exists. And of course, I couldn't help but conclude with any such developments should be rigorously evaluated, because of course I would say that, wouldn't I? And here's what I was thinking in 2012. Before we had the evidence from the Glasgow pilot, and at a point where a number of influential stakeholders internationally, not so much here in the UK, but elsewhere, were being what I felt was indefensibly evangelical about the rollout of Housing First. And I use the word evangelical quite deliberately, as it was more or less being presented as a panacea for homelessness in some quarters. So I won't read the whole excerpt out, but you'll see that I expressed a plea for the injection of agnosticism into debates about Housing First, and called for stakeholders here in the UK and indeed elsewhere to exercise caution before rolling it out at scale. I was still optimistic that it might well prove to work outside the US on the basis of what was being discovered in other contexts, including increasingly in the Western European countries that were further ahead in their development of Housing First under the European Commission Social Experimentation Project. But I just didn't think at the time that investment of large sums of money, public money and or charitable money, would be wise until we could be confident that the approach worked well in the UK too. Fast forward to 2016. After many of the studies referred to in the previous quotation had concluded, most notably Turning Point Scotland's pilot in Glasgow, This is what I said at a Homeless Link event in London that year, variations of which some of you will have no doubt heard me use on occasion up here. I said, I have subjected the evidence to scrutiny over the past 6 or so years and come to the following conclusion. And this is not perhaps the most eloquent thing I've ever said. Housing First is an absolute no-brainer. The evidence base is now so extensive and so compelling that any claim that it doesn't work really are indefensible. I reiterated that message in 2017 after comprehensively reviewing international evidence on the effectiveness of a whole range of accommodation-focused responses to rough sleeping. And I argued along with my fellow academics Pete Mackey and Jenny Wood that the evidence base on Housing First is exceptionally strong, far stronger than is true of any other housing-related intervention targeting rough sleepers, in fact. And that particular report also makes the point that many of the mainstream responses to rough sleeping in developed or global north countries are not actually founded on solid evidence. In fact, an awful lot of what is done sort of to and for rough sleepers internationally has not been rigorously evaluated. Housing First really departs from the norm on that. As the evidence base has evolved in the way I've described, the nature and tone of debate about Housing First has also changed. So 10 years ago, the stakeholders within the sector were asking, why should we do Housing First? Or as I noted earlier, claiming that they were doing it already when they clearly weren't. I think misunderstandings of that kind of order are now pretty rare, but there is still a lot of work to be done to ensure that stakeholders genuinely understand what Housing First is and what marks it out as different from other interventions, especially in the health and criminal justice sectors, but also to a lesser extent housing too, and some. And whilst I've got no scientific basis for any claim about how many people fall into this category, it does seem that some stakeholders, arguably a small minority, I think, simply refuse to believe it will work until they see it work in practice firsthand, with the known faces in their local area. This is in some ways really frustrating, especially to evidence nerds like me, but it's worth pointing out that these individuals very often become the strongest advocates of Housing First once they witness it work with people that they kind of personally had previously considered too difficult to help. I think it's fair to say that, those few exceptions notwithstanding, the sector has moved on from questioning whether Housing First works to asking how do we deliver it well in any particular context. So conversations now tend to focus more on things like, how can we maximise the likelihood of people thriving in other areas of life beyond housing sustainment, in combating social isolation, providing a sense of purpose, improving financial well-being, and so on. And also people are asking, how can we take the learning from existing projects and use the most recent evidence regarding the effectiveness of Housing First to challenge established systems as and where appropriate? On these issues, the evaluation of the Housing First Pathfinder programme, which is currently in progress, will be invaluable. So too will the findings of the 3 city region pilot evaluations in England, which are running in parallel. Importantly, these will provide more detailed evidence than we currently have on costs and the factors that facilitate or inhibit the achievement of positive outcomes for people being supported. I would also argue that lots of people have been asking, even if less publicly, why does Housing First work for the population it targets when other interventions have failed, and often repeatedly? This question has been a total preoccupation for me ever since I started reviewing the evidence on Housing First more than a decade ago. I've shared a few musings on this in the past, and I just want to highlight the headlines from these, using some observations made by the original tenants of the Housing First Legacy project all those years ago, back when it was a pilot, to illustrate the points made. There are, to my mind, 4 key ingredients that seem to underpin the success of Housing First: longevity, flexibility, stickability, and normality. So if we take the first of these, I'd like to highlight the immense value of 2 things as regards longevity. Firstly, long-term security of tenure. The knowledge that the housing is provided for as long as an individual wants it or needs it obliterates anxieties about what happens next housing-wise, and it frees up headspace to devote to other things. We should never underestimate the significance of this in fostering someone's recovery. Secondly, Housing First users I've spoken to over the many, many years have consistently highlighted the value of knowing that the support will always be there, even if it's not available right now. Further to these things, true flexibility in service delivery in terms of intensity, type and location, etc., gives service providers a much greater chance of remaining in a positive relationship with residents, as they're not being passed from pillar to post or having their past experiences of being let down by services repeated because, for example, what they need is outside of a service provider's remit or would exceed the number of support hours that are costed for. And here's that word stickability again. I used to apologise for using it on grounds that it's not actually a proper word, but now everybody does, and so I apologise no longer. And I've not yet found a better word to encapsulate what we all mean by this. Many of the people Housing First targets have been excluded from, and in their views rejected by, support services for years. Some have rendered themselves ineligible for support time and time again by failing to show up for appointments or not engaging in the way or to the extent that they're supposed to. So for lots, these patterns confirm their often long-held view that they are not worthy of support, and or that service providers, like so many other people in their lives, cannot be relied on. And so the stickability of Housing First support, which holds even when someone disengages or engages in really problematic or difficult ways, fosters trust and receptivity to support. The final ingredient I highlight is, I think, also pivotal to the success of Housing First, and it's just simply that it's so terribly normal. Support is not delivered in specialist homeless settings, but in someone's own home and community. This mitigates stigma and facilitates integration into mainstream society, if and when residents feel ready to do so, at the pace they wish to do so, and to the extent that they wish to. So before I finish, I want to reflect back on what I consider to be a key contribution of the pilot valuation, as it highlights something that I think we could all do with thinking more about now, given the ongoing implications for service delivery and commissioning. The evaluation findings on outcomes tallied really closely with those of similar evaluations elsewhere, so in things like housing, retention, health outcomes, and so on. But an additional thing it highlighted was that whilst individuals' experiences were, of course, highly variable at the individual level, there were discernible patterns to these. The final report distinguished between the trajectories of 3 groups with regard to the direction of and distance travelled on their journey toward recovery from substance misuse after they had engaged with the Housing First programme. So for around half of the tenants, outcomes were largely or uniformly positive overall and were on the whole sustained. Generally speaking, their substance misuse stabilised or reduced, in some cases ceased. Their physical and mental health improved, any prior involvement in criminal activity or begging terminated. Social support networks were strengthened, and they became increasingly engaged in meaningful activities within the community. Some reported having experienced quite difficult periods, but the general trajectory of their experience was one of positive lifestyle change and improved well-being. For a second smaller group, affecting around a quarter or experienced by around a quarter of the residents, periods of relative stability or improvement were punctuated by blips on their recovery journey. Symptoms of these blips included things like increased levels of substance misuse, usually temporary, and or deteriorations in mental health. These experiences often had a knock-on effect on their ability to manage their home, particularly their inclination to budget and or manage the door. They were also sometimes re-engaged with activities like begging temporarily. For a third group, again affecting slightly less than a quarter of the individuals, or experienced by around a quarter, the pilot provided housing stability, which they greatly valued, but there was little evidence of change with regard to most other outcomes. The individuals concerned continued to misuse substances at or near the same level they were before being recruited to the project, and or to be actively involved in street culture activities like begging. Managing the home continued to be an ongoing challenge, and their engagement was sometimes intermittent, but the security provided meant that they were more receptive to supportive interventions such as healthcare. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem possible to predict who will experience which of these trajectories, or indeed potential other trajectories. Incidentally, I once interrogated Samson Beres, the original architect of Housing First, in an attempt to see if he had any insights into whether it was possible to predict who Housing First would work for, or what sort of journey they might experience. And he was adamant in inserting that nope, you can't predict, you need to give everybody a chance. All these years later, I have to say, based on the evidence I've reviewed and generated, I totally agree with that. But I do think we would be wise to monitor and perhaps reflect more than we already have on the relative prevalence and implications of these sorts of patterns that I've just described, given the impact they have on the type and intensity of support required at different points, and the implications of that for forward planning regarding likely demand and associated commissioning arrangements. To conclude, personally, I think Turning Point Scotland and the housing providers who offered those first tenancies were very brave. There really was no guarantee that Housing First would work in the UK at the time, and there were plenty of stakeholders within and beyond Glasgow who were pretty convinced and or worried that the project was setting vulnerable people up to fail. It's fair to say that many lessons were learned in those early days and no doubt continue to be. In leading the way in providing Housing First, Turning Point Scotland has not only fed into the evidence base in valuable ways, but played a key role in changing the tenor of debate about the intervention. And by extension, they've played a really influential role in nudging this nerdy academic away from a formally agnostic standpoint on the subject. And on that note, I will end. Thank you very much for listening.
Sarah, do you have an opportunity to answer a question here?
Absolutely.
We've got a question coming through which asks, what does Housing First look like when it doesn't work?
Yes, when it doesn't work. One has to question whether it's, okay, so two ways to answer that. Sometimes some people don't want Housing First. So you could argue it doesn't work for the individuals who aren't wanting an independent tenancy, for example. So some people just aren't up for it. And as one wise Housing First provider recently said, you can't do Housing First to people. They have to be engaged in terms of the sense that they actually need to want a tenancy in the first place. Otherwise, everyone's wasting their time. I suppose that the other way that people, what it looks like if it doesn't work for someone is if they are recruited to a program, they are kind of willing to engage with it, but then for whatever reason it doesn't work for them, their tenancy fails, they disengage kind of repeatedly and or potentially kind of in the long term. I guess what does it look like? A lot of it comes down to the nature of the relationship between that individual and their support worker. So sometimes it could just be a failure of that relationship. Sometimes other people have just got other stuff going on in their lives and they just kind of can't cope with it at that particular point in time. But that's not to say, and again, Samson Beres would back me up on this, it's not to say that they won't in the future. So we should never write people off. But, you know, I've seen various programs struggle to support particular individuals, and it is really difficult, again, to go back to that point, to say, certainly to predict when that might happen or to say why it's happened. And what the answer is for those individuals at the moment, I don't know. If anyone works it out, please do let me know. I think that there are many people within and beyond the homelessness sector trying to find answers for that group, those two groups, people who don't want it, and or those who do kind of desire an independent tenancy, but for whatever reason struggle to maintain one, even with the kind of support that Housing First offers. That was a very roundabout answer to the question. I hope that was of some use at least.
Thank you for that. And I've just had a second question coming through. The question asks, have you had experience of people with no capacity struggling with Housing First?
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I think there are kind of three groups for whom Housing First should not be used. One of the individuals I've just talked about, those who don't want an independent tenancy, you can't do Housing First to people as noted. The second are people for whom it's effectively nursing care that they need. So it's kind of their physical health issues are such that actually Housing First is not appropriate for them. The third group is this group that you're talking about, people who don't have capacity, people who aren't able to understand kind of legal consequences of a kind of a contract that they would have with a housing provider, that aren't going to understand or fully comprehend the consequences of failing to adhere to the conditions of a tenancy, or failure to pay rent and so on. I think, again, where capacity is an issue, Housing First is perhaps not the intervention for them. Again, it might be that other forms of supported accommodation would be more appropriate.
At the moment, there are no more questions coming through, so thank you very much for answering those 2 questions.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
A question just come through at the last second there, and that question is, what are your thoughts on conglomerate housing first models?
Okay. a lot of people they know my views on it already. I have a number of reservations, a number of very strong reservations around congregate or kind of communal forms of Housing First. Key issue for me is it relates to choice. It's not what most people want. Housing First is all about user choice, and I've met very few people who actually want to live in those kind of communal settings. The main issue with it is that it doesn't do away with the kind of problems or issues and challenges that are associated with hostel accommodation that are the reasons so many of these individuals have cycled in and out of homelessness for so long. They've still got people chapping on their door at 2 a.m, asking for particular materials and so on. There's still all the kind of grievances and issues and dramas that kind of come with hostel life. And so, yes, there's all the intensive support. Yes, that's kind of the accommodation is available in the long term and so on. But it doesn't get around all the problems that meant people didn't do well in the staircase system, or that fundamental problem at least. I guess those for me are the main issues. And actually, in a number of contexts where both congregate and communal have both been used, people generally express a preference for the kind of scatter site. Sorry, where congregate and scatter site have been used, people have expressed a strong preference for scatter site, and generally do better in terms of outcomes as well. I have read some studies that have said actually people's social connectedness is better, or it's higher or greater in congregate models than in scatter site. However, when you look at the other outcomes and you kind of interview the individuals in those kind of contexts, yes, they're more socially connected, they have more contact with people, but that's often because of kind of peer networks associated with substance misuse, and people's substance misuse problems are often exacerbated. So, I think the measure of social connectedness is not often a helpful one to use in those kind of settings. You do need to actually go in and ask people what they want. And it's just not generally, those kind of communal environments aren't conducive to recovery from substance misuse issues and mental health problems, for example. And I'm not decrying them completely. I think if people express a genuine wish for it, then that should be respected. My concern is that if it becomes a kind of standardized form of Housing First, that will be what is offered to people because it might be easier to provide. And if that's what's offered, then the choice is being limited. And then, you're actually kind of compromising the fidelity to Housing First. So again, another really long-winded answer, but yeah, I'm not a fan based on the evidence of communal congregate forms of Housing First.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I think we've got 4 minutes left of this session. Perhaps there's an opportunity to answer one more question. I do see there are other questions sitting here. Perhaps, Sarah, you can take a chance to type up your answers to these questions. But one last one I'll ask you on this session would be, 10 years is a long time to think about a new approach. How can policymakers take evidence-based decisions quickly enough to make the difference?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I do think they need to be... Who am I to say? But I think when the evidence is so strong, as it has been from quite early days on Housing First, just needs to sort of take a bit of a braver step and have a bit more faith in it, particularly in a context where we just most of the interventions for this particular population aren't founded on evidence at all. So I think when something is showing such consistently positive outcomes, it needs to be jumped on a little more. But again, I'm not the one controlling the purse strings and having to make difficult decisions about, rationing scarce resources such as public funds. But yeah, I think I'm really encouraged that Housing First is being scaled up to the extent it is in Scotland, especially on the grounds of the evidence. But yeah, it's been a long old process, hasn't it? And it's like Housing First has required such a shift in people's mindset. It really kind of messed with people's heads for a long time. And those, I alluded to some individuals being skeptical about Housing First. They were very strongly skeptical, and for understandable reasons. But yeah, I think where the evidence is so strong, please people have faith in it.
Is there any evidence to suggest that Housing First approach reduces drug-related harm and death? And what evidence is there so far?
Okay, so the evidence on substance misuse is a little more mixed than the evidence on housing retention. But I use the phrase positive on balance, and that for most people their drugs misuse deteriorates. But substance misuse is such a, I'm going to use the word messy process. It's not a linear, clean, simple procedure that people experience. Housing First certainly, it provides that stable platform for people to make progress in those other areas. But I think it's something we need to look into a bit more. And again, the issues about the drug-related deaths in Scotland, we're in a really difficult context here in relation to that. So I think Housing First is important in providing that stable platform. But yeah, in terms of how to reduce the risks of harms and heaven forbid death, then that's something we still need more work on, and there are many professionals in the sector looking really intensively at that.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have ran to the end of our session. There are 3 unanswered questions. Like I say, Sarah, perhaps you can take the opportunity to reply to those. But thank you very much, and I hope everyone else enjoyed our session.
Thank you very much.